Marrying a handyman? How utterly humiliating. My mother's voice didn't just crackle over the line. It bit like a frost. My father, a man who measured worth in zip codes and stock options, didn't even grant me the dignity of an insult. He simply severed the connection with a sharp, final click. And Serafina? My little sister's laughter sounded like shattered crystal, cold and mocking. Who'd be caught dead at a wedding in a public garden? Grace. Think of the optics. They didn't just disapprove. They executed a total social blackout. No congratulatory flowers, no RSVP cards returned. Not a single seat in the front row occupied by anyone who shared my DNA. They whispered to our circle that I was a disgrace to the Sterling bloodline, a stain on our multi-generational reputation. So, I walked that grass aisle entirely alone. No Arthur Sterling to offer his arm, no Eleanor Sterling dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief, just the heavy, judging silence where a family's love was supposed to be. But here is the detail they omitted in their arrogance. The man they dismissed as a common trash man wasn't just fixing leaks. Elias Thorne was a former Stanford aerospace engineer, a mathematical visionary who had walked away from a seven-figure Silicon Valley salary to build a sustainable future on his own terms. And exactly 48 hours after our humble ceremony, his face and our wedding photo didn't just make the news. It dominated the tech empire headlines. Suddenly, my phone wasn't silent anymore. 135 missed calls sat on my lock screen, every single one from the socialites who had claimed I wasn't worth their breath. Now, they were suffocating me for a minute of mine. If you have ever been treated like a second-class citizen by your own blood, or shamed for choosing a partner who values work boots over wingtips, stay with me. By the end of this account, you will witness how one quiet choice and one explosive truth can turn a family's arrogance into a frantic scramble for relevance. This isn't just a romance. It's a masterclass in the kind of revenge that doesn't scream, it simply succeeds. Let me take you back to the cold corridors of the Sterling estate where the frost first began to set in. At 34, I was a senior portfolio manager in Manhattan, living in an apartment I bought with my own commissions, yet in my mother's eyes, I was still the responsible daughter, the one you use for errands, but never for the spotlight. Arthur and Eleanor Sterling weren't just parents. They were curators of a museum dedicated to their own importance. Growing up in the manicured hills of Greenwich, Connecticut, our family home wasn't a house, it was a statement of power. My father, with his silver hair and suits that cost more than a teacher's annual salary, was the titan behind Sterling Properties. He owned half the skyline and a real estate empire that felt as permanent as the mountains. My mother was the social architect, her name a constant fixture in Forbes and the Wall Street Journal, not for her business acumen, but for the ruthless efficiency with which she chaired the city's most exclusive charity galas. At the dinner table, we lived by a strict code. Patent leather shoes had to be scuff-free, and conversation had to be as delicate as the bone china we ate from. Presentation is the only currency that never devalues, Grace, my mother would say, smoothing her silk blouse. We didn't have feelings, we had reputations. If a problem arose, we didn't solve it, we buried it under a layer of prestige. Then there was Serafina. 2 years younger and light years more useful to the Sterling brand. She was the star, the one born for the country club life and the cameras. When she made head of the debutante ball, she was rewarded with a vintage convertible. When I graduated valedictorian from Columbia, I received a nod and a reminder to keep my hobbies from interfering with the family's social schedule. I was the eldest, the reliable one, the daughter they praised to guests but ignored in private. I spent years trying to fit the mold. I wore the muted tones they preferred, memorized the names of father's associates, and stood like a ghost at fundraisers, smiling until my face felt like a mask. But the Sterling name was a heavy coat that never quite fit. While Serafina was being flown to Paris for Fashion Week, I was quietly building my own life in a modest apartment in the city, surrounding myself with wildflowers instead of imported lilies. The crack in the facade happened at 29. Another Christmas, another set of diamond studs for Serafina, and for me? A leather-bound planner to organize my mediocre social life. That was the night the yearning to be seen by them finally died. I stopped asking for permission. I started living for myself. By the time I met the man they would eventually call the trash man, I had already disowned their expectations. I didn't know then that my quiet rebellion was about to collide head-on with their world of shadows. The silence of my independent life was shattered on a Tuesday morning in late April. I was preparing for a client meeting when a rhythmic, heavy thudding started behind the walls of my small master bath, followed by the terrifying, pressurized hiss of a pipe losing its battle with physics. Within minutes, a dark stain bloomed across the ceiling, and icy water began to pool on the tile, rushing toward my hardwood floors. I grabbed every towel I owned, but I was drowning in a domestic crisis I couldn't solve. 42 minutes later, the savior arrived. I opened the door to find a man who looked like the physical antithesis of every male I'd ever known. He was tall, his frame filling the doorway, wearing worn work boots that had seen better days and a navy shirt with a simple patch that read Thorn Plumbing. His calloused hands were stained with the honest grime of a morning's labor, and he gripped a heavy toolbox with an ease that made my high society upbringing feel suddenly fragile. "Elias Thorne," he said, his voice a low, grounded rumble. "Looks like you've got a minor disaster on your hands." He didn't wait for a formal introduction. He went straight to the source. I watched him work, fascinated by the quiet precision of his movements. He wasn't just fixing pipes, he was diagnosing a system. He moved with a level of focus that made the frantic energy of my Wall Street world feel like a nervous twitch. There was no swearing, no frustration, just the methodical turning of a wrench and the calm confidence of a man who knew exactly how things were connected. When the deluge finally stopped, he stood up, wiping his hands on a rag, a faint grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You're lucky," he said, glancing around my home. "The building's residential systems are ancient. They don't make them like this any more beautiful, but temperamental." I found myself doing something I never did with service staff back in Greenwich. I asked him to stay for coffee. We sat at my small breakfast nook, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't being evaluated for my net worth or my last name. He spoke about the mechanics of the city, how everything beneath our feet was a delicate web of pressure and flow. "Everything works," Elias said, "as long as the foundation is solid." His words felt like a prophecy. He didn't mention he had a degree from Stanford, or that he'd designed the propulsion systems for satellites. He just sat there in his work gear, talking about books and the simple beauty of a job well done. I was Grace Matthews to him, a name I used to hide the sterling shadow. I didn't want him to see the real estate empire Harris. I wanted him to see the woman who loved wildflowers and quiet corners. Our relationship blossomed in the quiet spaces between my corporate deadlines and his service calls. We spent our Sundays at local farmers markets and in the dusty aisles of used bookstores, far away from the prying eyes of the Greenwich, Connecticut elite. Elias was a revelation. He didn't need a boardroom to command respect. He carried it in the way he listened, truly listened, to the stories I'd suppressed for years. But the clock was ticking. After 4 months of bliss, I knew the shadow of the sterling name couldn't be avoided forever. I had to introduce him to the family. I called my mother on a rainy Tuesday, my heart hammering against my ribs. Her voice was like a velvet trap. "A guest for Sunday dinner, Grace? How delightful. And what does this young man do? Is he with one of the firms we know?" I hesitated, clutching the phone. "He's an independent contractor, Mother. He specializes in residential systems." There was a pause, a cold silence that felt like a draft from an open tomb. "I see," she finally murmured. "Well, do bring him at 7. We'll be serving 5 courses." The Sterling estate loomed like a fortress as we pulled up in Elias's truck. He had traded his navy shirt for a crisp blazer, but his calloused hands were still visible as he reached for mine. "Remember," I whispered, "whatever they say, they don't know you." The evening was a choreographed nightmare of social execution. My father stood by the fireplace, swirling a glass of 30-year-old scotch, his eyes raking over Elias like he was a structural defect in the room. "So, Arthur Sterling began," his voice dripping with practiced boredom. "Grace tells us you're in the trade. Tell me, Elias, is there much growth in fixing pipes these days? Or is it more of a day-to-day survival kind of life?" Before Elias could answer, Serafina sauntered in, her perfume a suffocating cloud. "Oh, Grace, you always did have a soft spot for a project," she giggled, glancing at Elias's shoes. "Tell me, do you get to wear a name tag? It must be so grounding to work with your hands while the rest of us are busy with, you know, the real estate empire." The dinner was a masterclass in silent warfare. They discussed the latest Wall Street fluctuations and a merger worth $85 million as if Elias were a piece of furniture. At one point, Eleanor leaned forward with a pitying smile. "Daniel. Oh. I'm sorry. Elias, do you find that your kind of work allows for a retirement plan?" Or do you just work until the joints give out? Elias didn't flinch. He set his silver fork down with a calm that made the bone china ring. I find that when you build things that last, the future tends to take care of itself, Mrs. Sterling. My father scoffed, a sound of pure derision. To them, he was just a handyman playing dress-up. They had no idea they were sitting across from the man who was about to disrupt their entire industry. The proposal happened in a cathedral of ancient oaks, far from the suffocating artificiality of the Sterling estate. There were no photographers, no Forbes headlines in the making, just Elias kneeling in the dirt with a ring that held a small, glowing opal, a stone that changed color with the light, just like the life we were building. When I whispered yes, I felt a weight vanish that I'd carried for 34 years. But when I called home to share the news, the response wasn't a celebration. It was a cold, calculated execution of my status. "You're actually going through with this farce?" My mother asked, her voice clipped and dangerously calm. "A Sterling woman marrying a trash man? Don't expect us to lend our presence to such a public embarrassment. We will be out of the country for your little garden party." Then came the notification that truly broke the last string of my loyalty. The family group chat, usually reserved for charity galas and social updates, pinged with a single message from Serafina, a laughing emoji followed by, "Does the wedding registry include a new plunger?" That was the moment I realized they weren't just toxic, they were irrelevant. I deleted the chat, removed their names from the guest list, and replaced them with the people who actually showed up, the coworkers who shared my coffee, the neighbors who helped me move, and Elias's mother, who treated me with more warmth in one afternoon than Eleanor had in a lifetime. We planned a ceremony for just 45 people, a quiet defiance in a world that demanded noise. The morning of the wedding was draped in a soft, silver mist. I sat in a small cottage, my ivory chiffon dress hanging on the door, no diamonds, no patent leather heels, just a crown of wildflowers I'd woven myself. There were 3 empty chairs in the front row, bearing signs for the mother, father, and sister of the bride. I didn't leave them empty out of hope. I left them as a testament to their choice. But then, a shadow fell across the doorway. It was my Uncle Silas, my father's younger brother, a man who had been the black sheep because he preferred a workshop to a boardroom. He looked at the empty chairs, then at me, his eyes moist. "I heard they weren't coming," he whispered. "I took the red-eye from Seattle. I'm not much of a social fixture, Grace, but if you'll have me, I'd be honored to walk you toward your future." As the violin started, I took his arm. I wasn't walking into a disgrace. I was walking toward the most honest connection I'd ever known. Elias stood at the end of that aisle, his face a map of pure, unadulterated devotion. He leaned in as we exchanged rings and whispered, "The world is about to get very loud, Grace. Are you ready?" The first weeks of our marriage were a masterclass in tranquility. There was no social pressure, no frantic checking of the Wall Street Journal to see if our reputation had fluctuated. We lived in a world of shared morning coffees and the simple rhythm of Elias leaving for work in his truck. However, the mystery Elias had hinted at on our wedding day finally unraveled on a rainy Saturday while he was out picking up supplies for a neighbor's renovation. I was looking for a spare charging cable in his small oak desk when I pulled too hard on a stuck drawer. The false bottom gave way, revealing a thick, weathered leather binder. I shouldn't have looked, but the first thing I saw was a seal I recognized instantly: Stanford University. Beneath it lay a diploma for a Master of Science in Aerospace Engineering awarded to Elias Thorne. My heart did a strange, erratic dance in my chest. As I flipped through the pages, I found technical diagrams labeled Project Etherflow, covered in dense mathematical equations and Stanford Aerospace Engineer certifications. There were active patents for a decentralized water filtration system and correspondence with venture capital firms like Summit Ridge. I sat on the floor, the cold tile pressing against my legs, stunned into a heavy silence. My husband, the man the Sterling family had mocked as a lowly handyman, was a high-level systems architect. He had spent a decade in the defense sector, designing proprietary technology for satellite cooling before walking away. Just as the weight of the discovery settled, I heard his boots on the porch. Elias walked in, rain dripping from his jacket, and stopped dead when he saw the documents spread across the rug. "I was going to tell you," he said softly, leaning against the doorframe. "I just wanted to make sure you loved the man who fixes the pipes, not the man with the tech empire potential." He sat beside me, his large, calloused hands resting on the folder. He explained that his father's illness had brought him home, but the plumbing business was actually a testing ground for a revolutionary, modular water grid system. He hadn't just been repairing leaks, he had been installing the prototypes for a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure shift. Then, he pulled out one last sheet of paper, an old email. It was an archived message from my mother, Eleanor, to a high-end matchmaker from 2 years ago. It included a list of suitable candidates for Serafina's next social conquest. Elias's name was on it, highlighted for his academic pedigree. But my mother had personally crossed it out with a brutal handwritten note. Too intellectual, not enough social capital, prefers blue-collar environments. Not our kind of people. They had known exactly who he was, but because he didn't care for charity galas or their real estate empire, they had deemed him invisible. My mother had literally rejected the most successful man she'd ever met because he wore a navy shirt instead of a tuxedo. The transition happened with the suddenness of a lightning strike. One Thursday morning, I walked into the kitchen to find Elias wearing a charcoal suit I'd never seen before, a masterpiece of Italian tailoring that made him look like a titan of industry. He wasn't reaching for his toolbox, he was checking his watch. "The summit is today, Grace," he said, his voice carrying a new, razor-sharp authority. "The one in Chicago. They've moved my presentation to the keynote slot. It's being broadcast live." By 2 p.m., I was curled on our sofa, my eyes glued to the screen as the news banner scrolled across the bottom. "Former Stanford aerospace engineer disrupts U.S. water infrastructure." There was Elias, standing on a stage that looked like a boardroom for the entire planet. He spoke with the quiet, unshakable confidence of a man who had actually built what he was talking about. He explained how his tech empire, built on the foundation of simple plumbing principles, would save cities $12 billion annually in wasted resources. The applause wasn't just polite, it was a roar of realization from the country's most powerful leaders. Then came the moment that shattered the sterling glass house. The anchor leaned in and said, "And in a world of corporate greed, Thorne's story is a breath of fresh air. He recently married Grace Sterling, now Grace Thorne, in a private garden ceremony that focused on values rather than vanity." A photo filled the screen. It was us, not a polished Forbes-style portrait, but a candid shot of me in my wildflowers crown and Elias in his blazer, looking at each other like no one else existed. My phone didn't just ring, it went into a digital meltdown. 135 missed calls flooded my screen within the hour. The first dozen were from my mother, her voice in the voicemails shifting from a frantic "sweetheart, there's been a misunderstanding" to a desperate "we need to discuss the Sterling property's synergy with Elias's new grid." Even Serafina had the nerve to text, "OMG Grace, why didn't you tell me he was that Elias Thorne? Everyone at the country club is talking. Can we do lunch?" The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. They hadn't changed. They didn't suddenly value Elias's heart or my happiness. They simply saw a new real estate empire being born and wanted a seat at the table they had previously set for my execution. As I watched the call logs grow, I felt a strange, cooling peace. My father, the man who wouldn't even speak to me on my wedding day, was now leaving a message about family legacy and strategic partnerships. They were finally knocking on the door they had spent a lifetime trying to keep me from opening. Elias walked back through our door that evening, tossed his blazer on the chair, and looked at my blinking phone. "I told you it would get loud," he said with a tired smile. "Do you want to answer them, or should we go get some pizza?" The doorbell at our apartment rang on a Sunday morning, a sharp, demanding sound that lacked any of the grace the Sterling name once stood for. I opened it to find the full delegation, Arthur, Eleanor, and Serafina, standing in a tight formation like they were preparing for a hostile takeover in a boardroom. My mother carried a box from an boutique bakery, and my father held a vintage bottle of scotch, the same kind he'd swirled with such contempt when he first met the lowly handyman. "Grace, darling," my mother cooed, her smile as fixed and artificial as the Botox in her forehead. "We were just in the neighborhood and thought we'd stop by to properly celebrate your monumental news." They stepped into our home without waiting for an invitation, their eyes immediately scouting for signs of the tech empire's wealth. Serafina had her phone out, likely ready to document her proximity to the man of the hour for her social circle. Elias was in the kitchen, casually leaning against the counter in a faded t-shirt, his calloused hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. He didn't stand up, he didn't offer a seat, he simply watched them with the clinical detachment of an engineer observing a failing machine. My father cleared his throat, the sound of a man trying to negotiate his way out of a corner. Elias, I've been reviewing the data on your water grid system. It's robust. Sterling Properties is planning an eco-development in the Hamptons, $125 million in projected value. I think a partnership would be the perfect way to bring the family brands together. I felt a surge of cold clarity. They didn't see a daughter or a son-in-law. They saw a lifeline for their own crumbling real estate empire. And if he really were just a plumber? I asked, my voice cutting through their rehearsed warmth. If the cameras hadn't found him, would you still be standing on my rug with that overpriced scotch? The silence that followed was dense, a vacuum of genuine emotion. Don't be dramatic, Grace, Serafina snapped, her facade cracking for a split second. We're family. This is how the world works. Elias finally spoke, his voice low and unyielding. Actually, that's how your world works. In mine, we don't partner with people who use their own children as an investment strategy. My father's face turned a deep, bruised purple. Before he could speak, he reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a cream-colored envelope. The olive branch was gone, replaced by the sterling legal protocol. If you won't play by our rules, he said, placing it on the counter, then you won't carry our name. This is a formal request for your voluntary forfeiture of the Sterling Trust and all future inheritance. To protect our brand integrity from your unconventional associations. I stared at the heavy, cream-colored envelope resting on our granite countertop. To my father, Arthur, this was the nuclear option, the final threat intended to bring a wayward Sterling daughter to her knees. He expected me to pale, to stammer, to beg for the safety net of the family fortune. But as I picked up the document, all I felt was a profound sense of lightness, as if a leaden shroud had finally been lifted from my shoulders. The legalese was cold and precise, a total surrender of my claims to the real estate empire, citing my unauthorized affiliations as a liability to their public image. You want me to sign away the legacy? I asked, looking him directly in the eye. Eleanor adjusted her pearls, her expression a mask of manufactured regret. It's about protecting the institution, Grace. If you choose to live in the world of tradesmen, then you shouldn't benefit from the world we built at Sterling Properties. Without saying a word, I walked to the kitchen drawer and pulled out a simple black pen. I didn't need to consult a lawyer or take 24 hours to think it over. My life with Elias had taught me that true value isn't something you inherit, it's something you forge with your own calloused hands. I signed my name at the bottom of the declaration with a steady, fluid motion. I didn't just sign a document. I signed my release papers from the prison of their expectations. There, I said, sliding the envelope back across the counter. I'm no longer a Sterling, I'm just Grace. And honestly, it's the best I've felt in 34 years. The look of pure, unadulterated shock on Eleanor's face was more satisfying than any Wall Street bonus I'd ever received. They had spent their lives believing money was the only tether that mattered, and I had just cut it in front of them. You're making a mistake you can't undo, Arthur growled, clutching the envelope like a weapon that had misfired. Serafina simply rolled her eyes, already checking her reflection in our hallway mirror, though her hand was trembling slightly. As the door finally closed behind them, the silence that followed wasn't heavy or hollow, no, was peaceful. Elias walked over and wrapped his arms around me, his presence a solid, grounding force that no trust fund could ever replicate. You okay? He whispered into my hair. I nodded, a small, genuine smile finally reaching my eyes. Better than okay. I'm free. We stood there in our modest apartment, surrounded by my wildflowers and his technical drawings, knowing that we didn't need their permission to build a tech empire or a life of meaning. We had already won the only battle that mattered, the one for our own souls. The tranquility of our new life was punctured at exactly 2:14 a.m. by the frantic, persistent vibration of my phone. I reached for it in the dark, my heart racing, expecting an emergency at Elias's lab. Instead, the screen displayed a name I hadn't seen since I signed away my inheritance. Serafina. Against my better judgment, I answered. The voice on the other end wasn't the polished, arrogant sister I knew. It was a jagged, sobbing mess of terror. Grace. Please, you have to help me, she choked out, the sound of wind and traffic in the background. It's Julian, the FBI, they were at the penthouse tonight. They've frozen everything. He's being indicted for a massive Wall Street Ponzi scheme wire fraud. Securities violations, it's all a lie, Grace. They took the cars, the apartment lease is in his firm's name, and they gave me 72 hours to get out. I have nowhere to go. I sat up, the cold air hitting my skin. Elias was awake now, watching me with that calm, intuitive gaze. What about Mom and Dad? I asked, my voice low. Serafina let out a hollow, broken laugh that turned into a cough. They won't even pick up the phone. Dad's lawyer called me. He said my association with Julian is a threat to the Sterling Properties brand. They've locked the gates at the estate. They told me to stay away until the press dies down. Grace, they've discarded me like I'm nothing. The irony was a physical weight in the room. The golden child, the one who mocked my handyman husband and my low-class wedding, was now an outcast of the very real estate empire she'd worshipped. She was a liability to the Sterling image, and in that family, liabilities were erased. Elias gave a small, solemn nod, reading the situation without a word. You can stay in our guest room for now, Serafina, I said quietly. When she arrived the next morning, she looked like a ghost of her former self. No designer luggage, just one scuffed suitcase and a pair of dark glasses to hide eyes that hadn't slept. As her heels clicked softly on our modest floors, she looked around our home, a home built on honest work and wildflowers, and she finally started to truly cry. Not the performative tears of a charity gala, but the raw, ugly sobs of someone who had finally realized that her entire world was built on sand. I handed her a glass of water, and for the first time in 34 years, I didn't feel like the lesser sister. I felt like the only one who was actually safe. For 48 hours, Serafina moved through our apartment like a hollow shell, her former arrogance replaced by a haunting, wide-eyed silence. She spent her days staring out the window, clutching a lukewarm mug of coffee as if it were the only thing tethering her to the earth. I watched her, waiting for the sister I knew to resurface, the one who measured humanity in Forbes rankings, but she seemed to have vanished along with her offshore accounts. Elias remained the epitome of grace, never once mentioning the insults she'd hurled at his worn work boots or his common profession. The turning point came on the third evening. I was returning from a late meeting at the firm when I heard a hushed, sharp voice coming from the guest room. The door was slightly ajar, and I stopped, my hand freezing on the hallway wall. It was Serafina. She wasn't crying anymore, she was negotiating. Yes, Mother, I'm doing exactly what we discussed, she whispered, her voice regaining that familiar, calculated edge. He's actually very kind. I think I can pivot this. If I can get him to publicly vouch for me, maybe even get a position at his new tech empire, the press will stop looking at Julian's fraud and start looking at my involvement in sustainable innovation. We can win the narrative back, Mother. Grace. No, she doesn't suspect a thing. She still thinks I'm here because I have nowhere else to go. She's always been the soft one, hasn't she? My blood didn't boil. It turned to ice. I didn't flinch. I simply pushed the door open. Serafina jumped, nearly dropping her phone as she scrambled to end the call. The silence that followed was thick with the scent of a fresh betrayal. How long were you planning to play the part of the grieving sister? I asked, my voice a low, steady blade. Grace, You don't understand, she stammered, her face turning a ghastly shade of pale. I walked into the room, folding my arms. I understand perfectly. I opened my home to you because I thought you finally saw the truth about the Sterling legacy. But you didn't come here because you needed me. You came here because you needed a PR shield. You wanted to use my husband's reputation to scrub the filth off your own. I have nothing left, she shrieked, the mask finally shattering. What do you want from me? Julian is facing 15 years in a federal prison. And Mom and Dad have literally erased me from the family website. I'm a Sterling. I don't know how to be a nobody like you. I looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't feel anger, I felt a profound, weary pity. She was 32 years old and had never spent a single second of her life being a real person. Everything was an optics play, a strategic move on a Wall Street chessboard that had already been flipped over. While Serafina was busy trying to repair her fractured image in our guest room, the rest of the Sterling world was starting to ignite. It began with a quiet, devastating headline in the business section of the Times. Whistleblower exposes systemic permit fraud at Sterling Properties. At first, Arthur and Eleanor treated it as a minor inconvenience, something to be hushed with a few high-priced lawyers and another of their charity galas. But this wasn't a fire they could put out with money. Within a week, state regulators and federal investigators swarmed the Greenwich, Connecticut estate. Documents surfaced, emails, secret ledgers, and offshore wire transfers that painted a picture of a real estate empire built on a foundation of shell companies and coerced zoning approvals. The integrity they had used as a weapon against me was revealed to be a hollow shell. The sterling name, once a symbol of untouchable prestige, was being dragged through the very mud they had accused me of embracing. I watched the news from our living room, feeling a complicated, heavy stillness. There was no joy in watching the house I grew up in be surrounded by news vans. Then came the final blow. My mother, the First Lady of Sustainable Philanthropy, was forced to resign from the board of the most prestigious foundations in the city. No farewell dinner, no commemorative plaque. Just a cold 5-sentence press release citing ethical inconsistencies. The world had finally stopped protecting them because they were no longer an asset, they were a liability. One evening, Serafina sat beside me on the steps of our porch. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a weary, genuine exhaustion. "They're selling the estate, Grace," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I turned to her, surprised. "Seriously?" She nodded, her eyes fixed on the wildflowers in our small yard. "The property taxes were unpaid for 2 years, and the legal bills are stacking up higher than the penthouse. Dad called me crying. He said he has to let it go. Beacon Hill. The trophy. It's all gone." I expected to feel a surge of vindication, but all I felt was a profound sense of peace. The shield of wealth they had hidden behind had finally shattered, leaving them as exposed as the common people they had spent a lifetime looking down upon. Serafina let out a short, tired laugh. "It's strange. I thought losing the money would kill me. But for the first time, the noise in my head has stopped. I don't have to be a star anymore." I reached out and placed my hand over hers. For the first time in the history of the Sterling family, we weren't competing for status. We were just two sisters sitting in the quiet, watching the rain. Inside, Elias was muted. The TV, the tech empire he was building was real, while the one we came from had vanished like smoke. The official launch of Elias's water infrastructure project was held in a massive auditorium in Chicago, but it felt a world away from the stiff, suffocating charity galas of my past. There were no patent leather shoes or forced smiles here. The room was filled with engineers, city planners, and environmentalists who were actually excited about the future. As I stood in the wings, watching Elias speak about his tech empire not as a way to gain power, but as a way to restore dignity to neglected neighborhoods, I realized that my husband had achieved more in 3 years than the Sterling family had in 3 generations. Later that month, I received an invitation that would have made Eleanor Sterling faint. A request to speak at a global forum in London about redefining personal value in a high-stakes economy. I stood on that stage in a simple navy dress, no designer label in sight, and I told the truth. I spoke about what it was like to be raised in a real estate empire where love was a transaction and worth was measured by Wall Street rankings. I shared the story of the man they called a trash man and how he taught me that a person's real foundation isn't their bank account, but their integrity. The most profound moment, however, happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon back home. We were hosting a small fundraiser for our new foundation, the Silas Sterling Fund, which provided vocational scholarships for students entering the trades. Serafina was there, no longer the socialite, but a woman who had traded her heels for flats and her vanity for a purpose. She was working as a coordinator for a local nonprofit, helping single mothers build independent lives. Her smile was finally real. It didn't ask for permission to exist. As the sun began to set over our yard, a familiar black sedan pulled up to the curb. My heart skipped a beat as Arthur and Eleanor stepped out. They looked smaller, their once impenetrable armor of prestige dulled by a year of legal battles and public fallout. My father held a small, recycled paper box, and my mother carried a children's book. They didn't march in like they were in a boardroom. They walked tentatively, like guests who weren't sure they were welcome. "We don't expect a seat at the table, Grace," my father said, his voice unusually soft. "But we wanted to see our granddaughter's 2nd birthday. If that's okay." I looked at them, the people who had called my husband a disgrace and boycotted my life, and I didn't feel the old anger. I didn't feel the need for a crushing revenge. I simply felt peace. I stepped aside and let them in. That night, as the fireflies began to dance across the grass, Elias and I stood on the porch watching our daughter play with a plastic toy wrench. "This is it," he whispered, pulling me close. The only legacy that actually matters. I nodded, resting my head on his shoulder. My family had spent their lives building a name, but we had spent ours building a life. And in the end, that was the only investment that truly paid off. If you've ever felt like a disgrace for choosing truth over status, or if you've been discarded by the very people who should have held you up, know this: your worth is not theirs to define. Build your own foundation, trust your own calloused hands, and remember that the best revenge isn't a loud argument, it's a life well lived. Thank you for staying with me until the end. I hope you'll join us for the next journey.